All right. Hello and welcome everyone to FWD20, the Age of Resilience. Before we get started on this session, I'd first like to thank you for being part of the FWD community. As you sit here today, you're virtually joined by 1,500 other business leaders across the globe. And although you can't see one another, we encourage you to find the time to connect on social media using hashtag FWD20. While you sit on today's sessions, we also encourage audience engagement. So please submit any questions you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we will be sure to reserve time at the end of this session to answer those questions live. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our next speaker. As a data strategist, he helps organizations across the globe use their data to make higher quality decisions. And today he will talk about a slightly controversial topic, and that is why you shouldn't build a data-driven culture. So without further ado, welcome Ruben Ugarte.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. And happy to be here. Good morning, everyone, wherever you are in the world. I'm in Vancouver, Canada here, and we have about 25 minutes, give or take, to talk a little bit. So let me get my slides working here. Okay. See, a little bit about me, my background, to help shape the context of what we will be talking about. I spent the past 5 years working with mostly technology companies, software, e-commerce, media companies. And of course, now with the emphasis on digital transformation, a lot of companies are becoming technology companies and really helping them with the data all the way from strategy to actually using it to come up with insights. And it's really interesting work, and there's lots of sort of cool things. There's a lot of excitement in this field right now, but there's also some challenges, and maybe some different expectations that companies have, and they're not being met. So really, today over the next 20 minutes, I want to have a special sort of conversation around maybe some of the challenges with data, or how companies are approaching data, some of the myths of data-driven cultures, and then an alternative, what I've been sort of tentatively calling the data supported culture. So I've been hearing a lot about, some slight controversy around this, especially for companies who are investing a lot, and this maybe goes counter to that. So we can sort of follow this idea for this conversation, that we're going to maybe hold two opposing ideas in the same time, but we still, we can still function. We can still make do here. So that's how I want you to think about this as we go through the next few slides. So let's start with stats. I love reading the surveys that different companies do on how companies are actually using data and investing in it and so on. So there's a couple surveys I pull here, one from 2019 and one from 2020, and every survey is very similar. They all kind of say the same thing. We're spending lots on data. We're going to spend more on data in the next few years. We can't really use most of it, and we're kind of struggling to get insights from the bulk of our investment, but it's still worth it, right? So some of the stats here, 92% will invest more in data. 69 don't consider themselves data driven yet. For example, 57% thought they were on par with their peers, and 17% for they were behind, and so on. So this is very similar. So the numbers do get better. I've been reading the stats for a few years now, so the numbers are actually improving. They're not staying still. But there's also something interesting about the way companies perceive the progress towards data and how they're actually performing. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to focus on. That I think a lot of these companies are actually doing much better than they think, and they might just be playing the wrong game too. So let's dive into that, right? When I talk about game, I think that there's an idea of what a data-driven organization looks like, what it should look like on a day-to-day basis. And this idea might actually not be correct for a lot of companies. It might be coming from the wrong sources. So for that, we can look at some of the myths of data-driven cultures. So the first myth is the data should be the first resource. That is, everything gets optimized around data. That's how, I've seen a lot of companies start to approach it. This is, you're sort of data-driven first. And this is similar to, when big companies like Google and Facebook started to change from, being like a web company to a mobile first company. I think Google now considers themselves an AI first company. So some companies want to be a data first company, which I'm not sure if actually is the right fit for most companies. So that's myth number one. Myth number two is really about the internal proficiency. And that is everyone in the company should be able to use data, visualize it, work with it, get insights out of it. For anyone who is trying to deploy a large scale data program within an organization of a significant size, this is really hard to do. And then lastly, the first myth would be around how you treat non-data opinions. There's a quote, I think, goes to, in God we trust, all others must bring data, seems to be the model for a lot of companies. If you don't have any data to back this up, this hunch, then there's no role for that here. So some of the companies that we know that use data really well are some of the big tech companies, right? We hear about them for good and for bad. I guess recently, maybe more for bad on how they're using data and the privacy limitations. And what I would argue is that for a lot of these companies on this picture, not all of them, data is their product. So a company like Google and Facebook, they happen to offer an email service and a map service, and Facebook has the Messenger and WhatsApp and so on. But what they're really into is the collecting data, and that's their product. So as a company, they arrange their company structure around that, and they have lots of data scientists, lots of data engineers, lots of ways to support that emphasis. We can maybe argue the same for Tesla. The data is a key fundamental to actually making the cars work, especially the self-driving cars in the future. But for other companies, they're not in the product of data. Data is there to support it, to help them make better decisions, to increase sales or reduce costs. But it's not the main thing. You're not rearranging your entire company around data. And I'll show you a little bit what that looks like really when you actually make this a priority, and this is the thing you want to focus on. But that's the first thing. I also, I'm a big fan of basketball, and I've been following basketball for the past few years. And there's a trend, maybe perhaps since Moneyball came out by Michael Lewis in baseball, to use analytics to try and quantify everything in the game. And the best example of this in basketball is the Houston Rockets. And they're very driven by analytics and how they establish their teams, what kind of shots they take, what kind of shots they avoid. And it works for them. They're a consistently playoff team, but they haven't won the championship. And in the NBA, that's typically the criteria you want to use. And for them, they might be actually trying to quantify a few things that are really hard to quantify. In the last few seconds, when you want to take a shot, should you want to let data tell the player, what shot to take, or just let that player's intuition and experience do it? So there might be an example of a company that's trying to really use data too much and maybe diminish some of the actual talent or the human element of basketball. So, making data the first resource as the myth number one. Number two, the internal proficiency. So every company has different kinds of roles and teams. Some teams are more technical, some teams are less technical. Some work is becoming inherently more technical, like marketing. But nonetheless, one of the big challenges I see companies face is they have lots of people, and they need to train them on how to use data, how to make data self-service, or maybe democratize data, as we hear sometimes. But in reality, I think for some companies, not everyone will be able to use data at a really high level proficiency, or maybe even any proficiency. And instead of trying to make everyone be data proficient on their own, some companies might actually just be better off with having support, having a data analyst or someone who can support companies, which means maybe less availability to data, but it still gets to the end point, which is the insights. And I think here the focus on hiring is important, which a lot of companies are doing, but an even better focus on training, right? And giving training to the right people so they can use data. And I see, there's a lot of work that goes here just to simply get people trained up on how to use data. This is a company I was reading about recently. Stitch Fix, they do personalized styling for you, and if you get a chance, you can read a little bit about the history, but this is a great example of what it means when you really arrange your company around data and you really commit to it. Their data science team is about 200 people, in a company about 1,500. They're a public company. They use data to determine what recommendations to make, but they treat it quite highly. And in fact, the data team has a seat at the executive level, at the strategy level. So they actually set strategy with data. And that's still not as common to see a data executive just represent data. Typically, data reports to the engineering department. So it's sort of mixed in with whatever else you're doing from a technical perspective. So they invested quite a bit from a very early stage. And they're likely a company you can say that treats data as their product. And it's what allows them to run their company. So if that's the path you want to take, then typically, you have to make similar investments and similar decisions around how you prioritize data and what kind of voice it gets in the company. And lastly, the non-data opinion. I see this more and more, where we'll be working with a team and, we'll have an executive that has 30 years of experience in this field, and they may have a hunch, but the hunch is not really backed by data just yet. And sometimes the opinion can get dismissed. And not to say that every company should go and become anecdote driven, but there's a balance here, right? And the balance between what the numbers are saying, what the intuition of the people in the company are saying, and trying to make the best decision of that. I actually think that data can actually help people train their intuition, in the sense that you're making a decision, you have the data, you run the experiment, you get the results, and you get this feedback mechanism on how well your initial guess was, or your initial plan, and you can use that to build your intuition and get better at it. So I think that there's a great potential there. Don't see it as much in companies just yet, but we're still in the early stage in the industry. So that being said, sorry, it's interesting, all this animations. So that being said, let me talk about what I think it's really the approach for most companies who are not treating data as their product, who are not investing in the same level that maybe a Stitch Fix is going to do, and who do want to balance, the intuition and the experience that a team has with the numbers. So, calling it a data supported culture, and the way I think about it is almost like a bridge. You have different teams, sales, marketing, operations, customer success, and data is really meant to support those teams, and it's really meant to help those teams make better decisions. But those teams still have flexibility in how they make those decisions, when they need to go to the data, when they need to dismiss the data, and try to find a balance. And when it comes time to establish this type of culture, this is the 5 steps in a broad sense that companies should go through. So to me, everything starts with people, and the reason why is, at the end of the day, this is who's actually going to be using the data. So we need to figure out what's their expertise, how technical are they, and make some realistic decisions here. Is this a company where we can have 100% self-service data, everyone can access it, build their own reports? Maybe. If it's not, then we need to, of course, figure out how we're going to hire and support the different teams and roles. I sometimes come across teams that where everyone knows how to use SQL, and everyone basically knows how to hop into the database, run a query, export data, and get the answers. And that's fantastic. That type of company can benefit from more advanced tools and techniques. And I also come across companies that have never had much data, and no one knows SQL. No one really knows how to build charts, in a comprehensive way. So we need to be careful, because giving data to people who don't know how to use it just yet would just simply frustrate them, right? And the thing to keep in mind is, for any company, data is an addition to what you're doing, right? So you already have a marketing team that's busy with campaigns and everything else they're doing, and you're asking them to add data, to use it on top of their already busy day job. So we want to make it easy for teams to get the most out of it. Once we figure out people, we look at process. Process to me is just simply figuring out how you're gonna get insights out of the data. And this might be figuring out what reports and dashboards you want to build, but also what kind of frequency you want to use the data. Do you want to report it on a weekly basis? Do you want to have a meeting where you talk about it? Do you want to build it into your sprint to be able to maintain it? So everything around maintaining data, using data, and getting insights out of it, and just thinking about this ahead of time. You can imagine how common it is. And we look at the stats that companies go through all the technical process of implementation, choosing tools, and then they get to a point where they're not really sure, okay, how do we mine it for insights? How do we actually find those things that will make our business better? Next, we go into providers. This is a very popular category. This is tools, effectively. Most people who reach out to me about tools. So here we tackle it and we figure out what sort of tools and technology do you need. There's lots of tools, lots of technology. I think it's getting better every single day. So you have lots of options here. And the thing is, once we get to this stage, we figure out people and process, we kind of know what kind of tools we need, right? We make some choices of what's actually going to fit our organization and not what's sort of the ideal stage, Then we go to training and just training end users how you use the data. Again, depending on who's going to access it, but making sure that there is comprehensive training here. And I typically recommend to companies to split in 4 ways. You have group training, which is what's typically done. But then you supplement that with one-on-one training. So you make it really specific to the person who's using the data. Reactive training, where you may create, let's say, a channel in Slack, and people can post their questions there and get responses quite quickly. And then, of course, documentation, where you can start to document dashboards, best practices, common analysis workflows, things like that. And then lastly, for some companies, you might get into some AI or machine learning, which is where, once again, we go back to the surveys, it's typically where a lot of companies are focused on. And there's lots of possibility here. There's a bit of hype in this world from what may actually be doable, but there is lots of potential in the machine learning world for a lot of companies. But it's typically, towards the end of a good process. I actually saw another stat from data scientists this time of how they spend their time. And I believe the number was about 60% of data scientists actually spend their time simply just wrangling data, right? Just trying to figure out where data is, what's there, how to fix it, how to organize it. And then they can kind of start working on the models. So if you spend the right amount of time in the previous steps, then the machine learning element can flow much nicely, because you have the data, you figure it out, you design it, you implement it. You don't have to go try to figure out where it's going to come from. And that's sort of the argument here. And for a lot of companies, what when I first started working, the ideal was I'm going to come in and help these companies be extremely data driven, and they're going to have dashboards all over the wall, and it's just going to predict their future, almost like a Minority Report type of world. But for what actually happened, the reality was, companies would get data, they would use it to make decisions, they would see how their work was being impacted, but it wasn't everything. They still had to make decisions without data. They still had to make choices with incomplete numbers, or maybe just a lack of numbers completely. So it was there to support, but not to replace what the company can already do. Final key takeaways here as we get to the final few minutes. Data guides decisions, but it's not everything. It doesn't have to be how you make every single decision. There's a balance between this and intuition. I think the second takeaway here is working with people constraints. Every company is different, every makeup's different, so you have to take into account. You can't just look at even someone like a Stitch Fix and say we're going to do that with our makeup. You would have to completely match the structure, how many data scientists they have, how they actually set them up, and so on. And number 3, trust and intuition. Again, I think lots of potential to use data to build intuition and help people get better at it. But it's not I don't think it's a dirty word or something that should be completely avoided in a data organization. And then lastly, playing the right game. So knowing what game you're playing, and if you are playing the game where data is your product, like a Stitch Fix, like a Google, like a Facebook, then that's fine. You got to invest appropriately. But if you're not those kind of companies, then you should be careful, because you might just find yourself with missed expectations year after year, even though you might just be doing fine. So with that being said, pass on for some questions, if there's any. I'll do my best.
Thank you, Ruben. All right, we have a couple questions here, so I'll start with the first one.
Okay.
What are some early indicators that you might be going down the wrong path or taking the wrong approach to building a data-supported culture?
That's a good question. I would say there's a few things that come to mind. First, it's just maybe on a high level of frustration. I work in companies like this where we have some numbers, we can make some decisions. The company's actually doing well. They're growing and the things that matter to them, but there still seems to be frustration there. That maybe it's not good enough. That yes, we have some numbers, but we're missing this other things, or we have this, but we don't have this machine learning. So that's one. So that, to me, sounds almost like an expectation issue, right? That there's an expectation of where you should be that doesn't match what you're doing, but what you're doing itself is actually pretty good. The second thing would be friction between what you hope would do and what's actually happened with your people. So we go back to this, maybe we have a company that's not geared towards self-service data, but you're trying to really make it work. You're really trying to get everyone to be self-service, and you're going through training after training, and it's just not picking up, right? People still need to go through a data analyst, and they still need to get support. So that to me would be friction in what the plan should be, or what you think the plan should be, and what actually your organization can support. And then lastly might be if you're seeing some discrepancies or maybe hard to justify budgets, right? So if you have a data budget of a few $100,000 a year or maybe more, and there's questions around, are we truly spending? Are we truly getting the value out of this money? And this comes up quite a bit, especially with tools. You're spending 6 figures, 7 figures for a tool, and someone will say, is this worth it? I think that's also a good chance to reconsider that maybe you might be spending the wrong tools in the wrong way because the value is not there, it's not apparent. It could also be that the value has to be made apparent. You have to do some work to show how this is being used. But nonetheless, those would be 3 signs that you can look for.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question comes from Sam. Do you have any suggestions for how to back up an intuitive hypothesis to test if there isn't any initial data?
How to back up an initial hypothesis? Yeah, there's more talk these days about decision frameworks, or actually experimentation frameworks, might be a better word, where you design experiments, you run them, you get the data back or some data back, you learn something, and then you do that over and over again. So when I think when there's less data or no data, and you only have intuition or a guess, I think you can still run through the process. You can still try to document what that initial intuition is, what you think will happen, why you think that's the case. But the valuable thing there is actually just to run it, right? And as you run it and you run those experiments, you get the data back. Now, you may have constraints around what you can do. You may have to go through an engineering team and build something, and that might take a couple of weeks and so on. So that's fine. But a lot of cases, when it comes to intuition, or where you have little data, what we really want to do is actually go get it. And to do that, we have to go run the experiments, see if that worked or not, come back, and then make another choice. So it's a tricky thing, because you might get stuck with little data, and then saying, we can't move because we have no data, and then you're in this you're in this loop. So you really just want to get started.
Thank you. And then we'll wrap up. We have one final question here. So how do you know you have too many cooks in the kitchen when you're building your data supported culture?
Yeah. When I work with clients, I always tell them there has to be ownership, right? That, or accountability. so the plan works. So I don't come across this issue too much about too many cooks, but I could see it happening where you have maybe multiple technical people or multiple business people who are owning it. What I would say is I would look for confusion among people who want to get access to the data. So if someone has a question and they don't know who to go to, or they're going to different people or the wrong people, that'd be one. And the second thing is, are you moving? When I showed that process before with companies, what you ideally want to go is you want to be moving through it. So you want to make choose people, then process, then tools, then training. You're gonna start add more stuff to it, add more data points. Then maybe get into the machine learning world. So if you're not moving, and the pace might be slow on your end. Or it might feel slow to you, but it should be at least be progressing forward. So if that's not happening, then that might be a case of multiple people trying to go in different directions and the whole sort of program coming to a standstill. So I would look for those two things when it comes to too many cooks in the kitchen.
Great. There's actually one more that I'll just ask before we close. So I think this is in regards to best practices and training, but this person's asking, how can I make the most of my organization's existing workforce?
Yeah. So I think this is a fantastic area to start. Hiring gets talked about quite a bit, and it's of course a lot of the data roles that you might want to bring in, whereas a data scientist, data analyst, data engineer are quite scarce. But nonetheless, training can be a way to close some of the gap and to find those people in your organization that might have an inclination for what you want to do. For example, you might have an engineer who wants to get more into data, and they might want to take on more of a data engineering role, or you may have a business person who may want to take more of a data analyst role, and so on. So training can be the way to take some of those people and actually use them. So the four things I talked about would be one. I also think looking at training as a process. So almost like a loop. If you think about those four things, the group training, the individual, the reactive, and the documentation, and then running those in a loop format to be able to keep building people up. So using the loop. And the second thing would be, looking for those people, because I come across them all the time. I work with really smart people across different companies, and I work with someone who's like, wow, this person could probably do quite a bit more if they were trained properly, and the company doesn't have to go out and find some mythical person out there, some sort of unicorn candidate. So those two things.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ruben. Really appreciate it. As we close out here, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining this session. If you had any additional questions that we did not get to today, you can email us. That's at hello@kinandcarta.com, just as a reminder. And we will be sure to address any of those or could pass them Ruben's way if you share your contact information. So we hope you join other sessions. Also, as a reminder, be sure to connect with us and connect with others on social media by using #FWD20. So we'll leave there. Thank you again, Ruben.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.